Good afternoon, good morning, or good evening, depending upon where you are in the world, and welcome to today's DevOps.com webinar. I'm Charlene O'Hanlon, moderator for today's event, and I welcome you, or should I say referee for today's event? I don't know, we'll have to see. We have a great event on tap. But before we get started, we do have a few housekeeping items I want to go over with you. First of all, today's event is being recorded, so if you miss any or all of the event, you will have the opportunity to access it later on demand. Following today's webinar, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And we are taking questions from the audience. So if at any time during today's presentation you have a question for either of our speakers, please don't wait, don't hesitate. Just use your GoToWebinar control panel and submit your questions, and we'll try to get to as many as we can near the end of today's webinar. Also, at the end of today's webinar, we are doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So please stick around. Hopefully you'll be one of our 4 lucky winners. All right, with that, let's go ahead and kick off today's webinar, which is DevSecOps Showdown, how to bridge the gap between security and developers. Our speakers today are Rhys Arkins, who is the Director of Product Management at WhiteSource, and Jeffrey Martin, who is the Associate VP of Product Management at WhiteSource. Gentlemen, thanks for joining me. I really appreciate it. It's great to see you both.
Thanks, Charlene. Nice to see you again.
All right. All right. Jeff, I'm not sure if you are on mute. I did not hear you speaking, but I want to make sure that your audio is good.
Let's try that again. Hello, nice to see you too.
I can hear you. Okay, all right. That's perfect.
I think I literally sat on my mute button, so sorry about that.
Well, okay, I don't want to talk about that right now. No, okay. All right, well, I know I'm going to let you guys get right into this because this is a topic I'm really excited about. So I'm going to take myself off camera, put myself on mute, and let you get right to it.
Great. So, like Charlene said, we're talking about DevSecOps and giving some insights from some research we've done here at WhiteSource. I'm not sure which of us is red and which one is blue, Rhys, but
yeah,
I didn't think this was going to be this amount of conflict. We're on the same team.
Yeah, we're not dueling here. We're representing both sides.
All right, let's get into it. Let's kind of summarize the big top insights here. So first, kind of a preview of what we're going to be talking about is that what our research showed is that most security professionals and developers feel like they have to compromise on security to actually get their job done, which is an interesting viewpoint, I think. But I do think that's sort of accentuated, if you will, by another one of our insights, which is that people were purchasing tools mainly to say that they had a tool instead of really marrying the security and developer needs to be able to actually accomplish the goal, which is to deliver secure and useful products. Rhys, I'll leave 3 and 4 here for you since I just did 1 and 2.
Yeah, sure. So the third insight from this survey was it was over 500 both security and developer professionals. So the third insight was that there still exists some pretty huge gaps in AppSec knowledge and skills amongst developers, and these are being somewhat neglected by organizations. You may guess which group out of security and developers felt that the developers were being neglected. We'll get to that. And point 4 was security professionals' top challenge is vulnerability prioritization, but the lack of standardized processes leads to friction with developers. So yeah, the people in security, their ideal is to triage, to prioritize, but it's still a little bit of a messy world out there, and this can lead to some friction with developers when you can't adequately prioritize or give them only the true positives instead of false positives.
I think it's interesting too, and we'll explore this as we go, but these are all very interrelated, right? Of course they feel forced to compromise. They have a knowledge gap. They're only purchasing tools to check a box, and they don't have processes. So of course they feel like they're having to compromise. They don't have the tools in place to actually accomplish, actual secure, useful coding. All right. Look, I just stole my thunder for the next slide. That was my fault.
Yeah, bottom line up front.
bottom line up front, I was just saying this, right? It's 73%, which is, I mean, 3/4 of security professionals and developers. So of all our respondents, that is, to me, an astoundingly high number, especially because our sample's a little bit, frankly, tilted towards companies that care more about security because they're the ones we reach the best. So
Yeah,
this means 3/4 of the people who care about security feel like they're compromised.
exactly. We already have a bit of a confirmation bias, by the people who participate in this type of, survey, and then out of those, already such a high percentage feel forced to compromise. Frankly, I think this will be one of the points that we'll want to drill down on more in next year's survey, because there can be a lot of reasons behind this type of figure. I mean, so first of all, like, you can never be 100% secure. I mean, it's a constant moving target. So it's a little bit hard to draw the line as to where to say what's secure enough, considering that by some definitions, you can never be fully secure. So I think that's one kind of aspect. There's a lot of perception there. The other thing is that I don't think like this is getting worse in some way. I think actually it's the fact that people are being more aware of security in the last few years.
Yeah,
So I mean, companies like WhiteSource, we're helping people be aware that there are a lot of vulnerabilities, and especially in like your code. So that awareness that there is a lot of vulnerabilities out there, and then people are, shipping new releases without knocking off like 100% of their, their WhiteSource alerts. I think it makes some sense that some people would consider that to be, compromise, because ideally, it's like if you have a vulnerability, it should be gone, not a known risk, in shipping. So I'd love to drill down on this one more in next year's survey. I think the next slide, though, Jeff, also is on this topic.
it is. I did want to make one piece just because somebody put this in the chat. They said, aren't there 3 roles, operations as well? And yes, but increasingly with this DevOps motion, those roles are really blending and collapsing. So I think that's a slightly different piece. But yes, there is operations roles as well. This is more focused on these 2 roles.
Yeah, it's a good question. I think that for many of these, you could, instead of saying developers security, you could sort of say, dedicated security professionals and others for whom security is a part of the job, but that's not their, their number one role, capturing
Yeah,
development and ops.
and we even included that in the next slide thing, actually, where are you in your DevSecOps maturity? Where are you in that journey? That includes all 3. And so when we asked, how mature do you feel like your DevSecOps practices are? Most people said it's getting better. And I think this is sort of one of those other, maybe this should have been insight 5, right? Which is, yes, there's a long way to go. Everybody feels like they're compromising, but things are on the right track. Generally speaking, most of the companies we talk to, they're either, pretty happy with where they are, or they're at least making progress in a steady way towards where they want to be. Only 18% of the people who responded said they felt immature, which I guess speaks for itself, right?
Yeah, I mean, we do more than one, research report like this each year, and we have similar questions to this. And I actually think it's refreshing when you see a small percent say that that their DevSecOps practices are mature, just because you you should never be too overconfident in the area of security. Like I said, it's almost possible to be 100% secure. You don't want to suffer from an overconfidence where you're never looking over your shoulder or considering what are some of the blind spots you have and so on. So it's also good that people are not we know that the industry in general is still maturing, so it's good that the majority of people don't have a misplaced confidence in their maturity.
It is great. I love seeing that it's actually like, okay, we're on the right track. It's getting better. I do wonder where in the journey those 20% who are mature really are, because like you said, everything is constantly changing.
Yeah, I'd love to chat with some of them.
So this is the one that, kind of going right back to it. Are you forced to compromise in order to meet the deployment cycles? And this is one I was kind of hoping was going to keep getting better in terms of falling, right? Ideally, you would want to see year over year this continually go down, that people are being forced to compromise less. But like you said, I do wonder how much of this really is, I feel like I'm compromising versus I actually am. Risk management is not 100% game. You do not fix every risk. You have to triage, you have to prioritize. So I think if we phrase this question a little bit differently next time around, we might be able to get some slightly different answers and correlate them. But I think a lot of this is a function of, like you said, we don't fix everything.
Yeah.
But you probably don't want to fix everything. It's not the most efficient way to, well, prioritize your efforts.
Have you seen there's sometimes like studies people do on like social media like Facebook, and they say that like actually like posting on Facebook can leave people feeling worse about themselves than they
Yes.
did, because they get to see everybody else posting their best life. And I have to wonder a little bit here whether the fact that security tools like ours have really gone leaps and bounds in the last few years, helping identify and alert people, whether like that's kind of increased people's perceptions that they're not doing a good enough job, um,
Yeah.
versus before, when people had a little bit of a maybe a blissful ignorance.
I mean, if I only know about 20% of my problems and I fix all of them, that feels like 100%.
Yeah,
But
so
when
you
I
get down
have,
to know.
when I look at 100% of my problems and I'm still fixing 40% of them, I'm fixing double the amount, but it feels like I'm missing pieces because I know what I'm missing.
Yeah, and again, the bias of just the people who have, who care enough about security to answer these types of questions and surveys. I think that they'll be really aware of everything they haven't fixed, much more than, say, a typical person who has a less interest in it.
So, I mean, look, Rhys, you do more development than I do. Um, where do you think that line kind of should be? In an ideal world, what would you say this percentage should be?
Yeah, it's tough to say because it really is a perception rather than, like it's quite subjective rather than objective. It's hard to kind of measure. So this would be another one where we'd be interested in drilling down into these types of, trying to quantify this just a little bit more. To give you an example of something, we've done at WhiteSource, I'm sure you're aware of it, Jeff, but for everyone else, something we've done recently is, so, you think of status checks in a development lifecycle. So, you have a status check that tells you that there are, vulnerabilities in your code. Now, once upon a time, in the early phases of these developer tools, people used to get, a failed check run if there was a vulnerability in their branch, right? It sort of makes sense, but the challenge was that people do have this baseline of vulnerabilities that they don't have time to fix yet, and it really increased the noise level. So what we changed to default to was to actually only fail, a branch or a pull request if it makes things worse. And we also give a really good, thumbs up, attaboy, if you make things better. If you actually are, contributing if you're contributing
Fix.
something
Yeah.
so that fixes things, then we give a positive reinforcement. So I think that is like an example of where security tools can also do a better job, and not being so down on on everybody's branches and pull requests.
Yeah, and I think the other piece here is just not fully communicating the risk mitigation strategy, which sounded like a whole bunch of business speak, but really all it boils down to is, hey guys, we don't have time to fix absolutely everything. Here's how we decide what we're fixing and what we're not. And if you communicate that, it feels less like a compromise and more like you're executing a well thought out plan.
Yeah, I'd not be surprised if developers who belong to an organization with the luxury, we'll say, of a dedicated security team probably feel better about their security positioning than those where the developers are fully responsible. Because to a developer, you probably feel the pain of every unpatched vulnerability, whereas security professionals are more used to what you say, which is that you manage risk, you don't like just solve it.
Right. You're not just secure or not secure. You're on a spectrum somewhere and you have to draw that line.
Yeah.
All right, insight number 2. AppSec tools are bought to simply tick the box. Wow, just to make a pun here, this kind of ticks me off, actually, because it's disregarding the developer's needs and processes. And just to be blunt, we're product people. We spend a lot of time trying to make sure the product meets the needs of developers and processes. But people who buy tools just to tick the box drive product people crazy. But I also just think I don't know, it's a sign of where we are in a maturity level as an industry of software development still.
Yeah, I mean, awareness goes up. You've got, your CISOs and so on, and VPs of engineering. They realize that if something went wrong, and because we're not on top of everything, things can go wrong. If something went wrong and they can't say that they've, ticked all the boxes, then, they're going to be in trouble. So maybe we've seen a bit of a rush to tick the boxes instead of work out what tools like are really effectual.
Yeah, and I mean, look, we get asked for advice all the time from sometimes very big enterprises, and every once in a while, I'll be like, "You guys bought this a year and a half ago. You shouldn't be asking this question now. You should have asked it about a year and a half ago." So I do think some of it might just be they buy it originally to tick the box, and then over time integrate it better. It's not just by ticking the box. And I think we found some kind of pieces here that might help when we sort of talk about how they adopt this, which realistically, even if you buy somebody to tick a box, there's still a need. Now you have a solution. How do I actually implement this solution and actually make it useful?
Yeah, so
I
this
mean,
one's
look,
pretty
there's a
much a
lot
dead
of
heat.
data on this one.
This one's pretty much a dead heat. And the only thing that I found, then interesting about this was just the second one, accuracy. I don't like wasting time. I mean, all of this could be within a margin of error, but we see that developers lend towards accuracy a bit more than security. I think that's because in general, with this type of open source security, it's the developers that need to fix it. So when you get those false positives and somebody spends a half a day or longer fixing something to only discover that it actually was never a threat in the first place, it's the developer that mostly feels that pain. So I think that's why you see them a little bit higher here. But even then, these results are pretty well aligned, and that's great.
Yeah, and I think actually it's funny because the percentages sort of align with a maturity or an adoption model, at least in my head, where the very first things you worry about is how am I going to integrate this into the tools I have, right? It's kind of the first thing you do to actually install and implement and get going. And then as you go through that, yes, you want to have some accuracy in there, but things like the remediation advice, you know, before you start worrying about, am I getting advice on how I should fix this that's useful, you have to worry about making sure you know all your problems. So I think it's interesting because to me, this sort of flows with the adoption curve.
Yeah, I think this is good. The fact that it's similar also reflects that security professionals recognize that it's typically, the people classified as developers who ultimately do the fixing. So it's good to see that, their perceptions of importance of different features are pretty well aligned here.
Yeah, and I mean, look, obviously we make this type of solution, right? But actually, I see tons and tons of interest about remediation advice, kind of before people purchase or while they're evaluating. But it tends to be one of the last things you really implement because everything else is sort of in the way. I do also think it's an interesting one that it's basically split even between ease of use, accuracy, and ease of integration. It's, everybody wants it in their tools, but I think it matters too how easy it is to use inside those tools. They just want to solve the problem. They don't want the software to get in the way.
Yeah. Also keep in mind this type of question, has a little bit of your electoral college kind of challenge, right? Because you got to pick one. So,
Yeah.
if you had a flow of kind of a voting here, it'd be interesting. You might see remediation advice, being a solid number two for many or something like that. So, this is what happens when you ask people to pick the number one most important thing.
think you're implying that we need to implement ranked choice voting. So I don't
No,
know whether you're applying that for the Electoral College or for the survey, but either one works.
yeah. I mean, before you go any further, I'd just like to remind you, we like to make evergreen content here. So, you know,
Oh, fair enough.
yeah.
I don't think that's ever gonna go get fixed, so we're good. Um, all right, so security professionals usually consider other priorities over developer adoption. Nobody was surprised at this, not even a tiny bit, because security professionals' first and foremost concerns are basically making sure that the risk is measured and mitigated. Adoption is the nice to have because to some degree or another, there's not a choice for the developers.
Yeah.
Uh,
I wonder how much that's a matter of security thinking, well, if I gotta sort these or order them, like developers have to do it anyway. So I'm gonna put that one lower and I'm gonna go for like, you know, early adoption and so on because you know, they don't really get a choice in this. Like if we say it's important, then developers will need to get on board. So it does contradict a little bit the unity we saw in the, you know, in the distribution of the previous answer.
it does. I think though it sort of it matches with the piece of checking the box. Because
Yeah.
if you're more concerned about purchasing it for checking the box, you're a little less concerned with adoption. um, but you know, honestly, like this is what the data said. Um, I think a lot of these people are wrong. You know, hot take
Yeah.
here.
I mean, I say as a security professional, I can see early detection being important. You know, you're the security,
Sure.
you know, person in your company, and then you know your boss or someone else's boss comes up and they're like, oh, did you see that, you know, that new security problem that everybody's talking about on Twitter, or that's, you know, just going on, you know, ZDNet or something, and you kind of say like, nope, you know, I haven't, no, what's that one? I mean, so I can see why security professionals would love to sort of have that early detection. You know, it's otherwise they look like they're not very good at their job.
Oh, absolutely. But I think developer adoption should realistically be, you know, 2 or 3 in an ideal world if they were really thinking about what they need. And it's because increasing that flow of communication and making it as easy as possible for people to actually use the tool is how you actually get more secure, not just how you know about your problems. Um,
Yeah,
and
I
ultimately, the goal is not just to know your problems, but it is to be more secure.
yeah, I would be shocked if this one isn't higher in future surveys.
Yeah, this should, I hope, uh, really go forward. That's why we put it in red, right? That's
Yeah.
clearly. Um, honestly, actually, I don't know if I would disagree with the rest of that order at all. Like performance should be the least concern out of these. Um, so absolutely. Uh, what does all this mean? Big question, right? Um, so here is, I think, one of the more interesting pieces for me, which is what types of AppSec tools are people actually putting in and using? And you can see this little bit of gap between the security and the developers. And I think a lot of this really boils down to this, just to go back a slide and confuse everybody, right? They're putting developer adoption towards the end about what they care about. So unsurprisingly, developers adopt things less than security actually wants them to be using it. And the difference sort of maps with the difficulty of the technology. So I'll let you give some color commentary on that one because I know
Yeah.
you have some
Well,
feelings.
I mean, buying a security tool that isn't adopted by developers is like taking out a gym membership that you don't go to. You know, it's going to cause it's a waste, like we say. So, by the way, we have a little bit of an alignment on the x-axis here, but the ones at the end we see with the quite high adoption is like web application firewall and pen testing being quite high, and on the left we see SAST, DAST, and SCA, and we see the highest gap in SAST, DAST, and containers. Interestingly.
Yes. Yeah, so sorry about that. I didn't even notice that when we went through these, but yeah, the fifth from the left there, which
But I'm
is,
not surprised at all that container security has the biggest gap there. One of the biggest challenges in container security is the huge amount of false positives. Containers, are often built off like base images. And so, if you scan the base image, you sometimes find some outdated libraries, which
mm,
just are not touched at all by your application, but they're there. And it's quite challenging to essentially use any type of like effective usage analysis to determine if if these are truly dangerous or not. And it's in a pretty bad state where people are rushing to get container security. Tick the box, right? We're using containers,
oh
we
yeah,
need container security. Container security is telling you you've got like hundreds of like high severity vulnerabilities in like the base image that everybody's using. It's a really bad spot because it just becomes too much. And I think developers understand that. They take a look, if there's too many like false positives and you say developer, you have 100, high and critical vulnerabilities, and then the first 5 are all, false positives. Developers often don't keep going after that.
yeah, they just,
So
okay, great, thank you. Yeah. I find the SAST one a little interesting too. I wonder how much of that is really just related to kind of where it fits in the pipelines, right? Because SAST takes a while.
yeah,
It might just be consumed more by the security professionals. I think a few of these other techs are very similar like that.
one of the like when you do say a SaaS survey of people's satisfaction and use of SaaS tools, pretty much the number one objection people have again is the false positives. So when I see these results, I see a high correlation between false positives and developer adoption. That also ties back to the earlier survey where developers, rated accuracy much higher than security professionals did. Security professionals, I guess, don't want to miss anything. Developers don't want to waste days in a week on things that, that aren't actually a problem.
And I mean, let's be clear too. It's not the most fun development activity. It's it is not enjoyable to go trace down different security vulnerabilities and see if you need to mitigate them, or to look at the security report and actually try to hunt down whether or not that's actually matters to you. It's developers would rather do other stuff, to be
Yeah,
blunt.
but we just got another question coming in. Are most of the app scans in the pipelines already? You mentioned pipelines, and I'd say that's a fair. I'd agree on that one. It's fairly true. I mean, like a web application firewall, that's not so much, and pen testing doesn't quite fit. But most of the other types of tools, certainly SCA, SAST, DAST, container, people are trying to get that into pipelines, into continuous integration. Some of these tools don't always fit well because they take up massive amounts of memory or time.
Yeah, and that's kind of why I highlighted SAST, right? Like it might be an occasional scan, not in every build activity, which is anytime you're doing that where it's not a every build, every test cycle, but only occasional, you end up seeing it adopted more by the security people as sort of gatekeepers than directly by the developers, right? The more iterative it is, the more developers take it.
Yeah.
Ooh, okay. The rainbow chart here.
This is back to the tick the box.
It is, honestly, but I mean, I'm a big fan of regulations and compliance. I just am. So look, this is the top 2 reasons is meeting regulations and compliance with some sort of industry standard. It's a big deal.
Yeah.
But I think we kind of know this intuitively because this is one of the reasons security has really blown up in the last 5 to 10 years.
Yeah.
Um, you know, it's not just that people want more secure code. It's not just consumer demand, frankly, for security. It's also because there are people telling you you have to be secure and you have to meet certain standards for different reasons. PCI and HIPAA are the ones that really jump out,
Yeah.
and they're the highest amount. You want to deal with health information, you better be HIPAA compliant, which means you have to have a certain level of security.
Yeah, I think, this question's been asked in different ways for a while now, and the answer never surprises us, that it's essentially, I have no choice is the biggest answer. I would love actually to improve on this question maybe for the next survey, and I'd love to hear which types of tools people would not buy unless they were obliged to. I mean, because just because compliance is the number one reason, that doesn't mean that they wouldn't otherwise buy it anyway. It's just more like obvious. Well, I legally have to. Like that's clearly going to be the number one reason. It would be curious to see, like, if you took away those type of bounds, which tools do people think they would buy less of if they didn't have that requirement? Because it's a little bit hard to judge that from now. I mean, you can answer honestly that compliance is the number one reason. It doesn't mean that
Yeah,
that you don't have
and
other reasons.
I do think it's important. We actually phrased this question as, how do you justify purchasing? So to me, this is, I go to the boss and I say, boss, I need X amount of money for the tool. And he goes, why? And the easiest answer to get a boss to say yes to spending money is because we have to.
Because it's otherwise illegal.
Yeah,
Yeah.
otherwise we're doing this illegally. So,
Yeah.
okay. But I did find it interesting because I've seen the compliance with industry standards become more and more important. So look, the industry specific stuff, that just is what it is. That's but you basically opt in to a lot of these ISO specs, or you're forced to by your customers because you're providing software to another vendor, for instance. This is something that has been, I think, growing increasingly. And it's interesting because I don't think we're all that far away from that just being the default for new software, which has some interesting effects on things like small development shops, because that kind of compliance comes with a huge chunk of overhead. All right, but I'm just going to read from the slide here. Meanwhile, day-to-day security needs are pushed aside. So basically, hey, I'm going to the boss and saying, we need to meet this compliance thing. That's why I need the money. So look, if one of my people said that, I would want to measure, okay, great. How are we doing against that compliance thing? Instead of measuring it against things that actually matter. I didn't mean to hit the button there, sorry.
It's okay, we can move forward.
All right, number 3, the knowledge and skill gap. Still a big thing, still neglected. I just happen to really like this one. I think it ties into some of the other pieces we were talking about, which is, how long has your application security program actually been in place? And relatively few people of 5 years and more. Look, app security is really a journey that most people started within the last 5 years. Any explanation, though, kind of at all, for the difference between security and developers here?
Yeah, I do, because I think that we probably got, again, the bias. I think that now if you are, if this represented developers and security, with an equal share from the same companies, then it would be very, very weird. But I think what you're seeing here is you're seeing like security conscious developers who don't have a dedicated security team or program answering the survey. So I think that's what explains, this gap, because remember, they're not necessarily answering about the same question. The developers could be, answering about a company that doesn't have a security team or program, while the security
True.
people answering have more like.
And actually, it just occurred to me too, it could just be that the security guys say, yep, we checked that box 4 years ago, and the developers are like, yeah, we're not really doing anything.
Yeah, yeah, it can also be a little bit related to adoption.
And this sort of just goes right along with that. Smaller organizations have less of an AppSec program in place than bigger organizations. No surprise there. Security tends to be adopted by enterprises first.
Yeah. I mean, I'm not casting any aspersions here, but if you were just making up this data, that would be exactly what it would it would look like.
Yes.
The smaller the company, the less likely that people will have like a formal program in place, or for the less time.
Yeah, and I do think it's interesting that the cutoff seems to be something like 500 employees, where it has that first big drop. That's also kind of the traditional cutoff for a bunch of compliance and other pieces as well. So that 500 employees matches other forms of activities that are like security.
Yeah, I mean, I bet, of course, if you're doing like an extremely wide survey and you're going down to companies with 10 developers or something, you'd be pushing towards 100% with no,
Of course.
formal program in place. But in these surveys, we generally tend to get people from the larger companies answering.
And here's this other piece about the skill gap, because there's two ways to close a skill gap: hire people with the skills and knowledge, or train the people with the skills and knowledge. And frankly, in the security space, you have to do some training just to keep up. So interesting, but very spread across here. It's almost even-ish. A few more people had no secure coding training. I don't know if I'm really surprised at that.
I'm not surprised by that.
Yeah, it's pretty straightforward. I think a lot of times, unless you're in a very big organization too, it's the kind of thing where maybe companies don't do enough developer training, period, not
Yeah.
just secure code. Um,
As an industry, we still haven't worked out just to what extent developers should be like security aware. Like there's sort of a point of like diminishing returns between, how much, teaching developers like a little bit versus a lot and what the return is. Instead of teaching all your developers a lot, you may be better off having, a security person that can be kind of like a coach. I think that there's a lot to be said for, teaching developers, a small to moderate amount. What's most important is they know when to seek help. It's
yes.
like, don't write your own encryption. Like that's a really big warning sign. Those types, are you storing personal information? That type of stuff. These are kind of easy ones, concepts to teach, and you don't have to teach them the insides of encryption and things like that. This is not something where I think, oh, 37% don't get secure code training. I mean, ideally they'll get some, but it's not like you're going to turn every developer into a security professional in the future.
No, I do think I'm going to bet too that a lot of the security people answering this are like, yes, we have a training program, because they have a document somewhere that says they have a training program, and once a year everybody has to sit through an hour piece, like a lot of the HR regulations we all have to handle. So every year you get training on sexual harassment. You make sure you view that video. I think developers, when they hear secure code training, they don't hear the same thing necessarily as a security professional.
Yeah.
All right, last big insight. Security professionals' top challenge is prioritization, but they have no process for it.
Yeah.
I mean, it's kind of amazing to say this, but look, it ties into everything else we were talking about. You have a lot of vulnerabilities. How do you know what to focus on? How do you know which ones matter? You can't just wing that. You have to have a plan, a process. And I'm not exactly surprised that's the number one reason. I do think a few years ago, the number one reason might have been budget. So it's nice to see that, that fell. But fundamentally, yeah, now it's not a question of justifying the tools. Compliance sort of justifies the price. But actually being able to use them and actually use it to mitigate your risk in some sort of reasonable process.
And
Any
we're
other
not seeing
really
executive sponsorship being much of a problem at all anymore, which is a good sign.
Yeah, I think it's tied with the budget too, right? Of course,
Yeah.
those things sort of have started falling by the wayside now that execs are, of course, yeah, we need to be secure. You need tools for that, buy them. But I think people aren't focused as much on building processes, because that's actually a lot of hard work.
Yeah.
And it requires a lot of compromise and discussion, and it's a lot harder than just purchasing a tool.
Yeah. I mean, it's interesting to see the number 2 problem answered by security professionals in the survey. The security professionals said the number 2 problem is lacking skilled AppSec personnel. I don't know by that if they're kind of meaning that the developers, they need to kind of do the majority of the heavy lifting,
Mhm.
haven't got training.
Could just mean they need to, they want a bigger security team as
That
well.
yes, that's the other possibility. I think it's good though that the security professionals rate the #1 problem as being vulnerability prioritization, because like I'm a firm believer that, like I said, the more false positives you keep sending to your developers, the less they buy into the security program.
Yeah.
You know, it's like crying wolf. There's a while where people just get tired of it. It's very good that security professionals recognize that as being the #1 challenge, because that really is something that security professionals can lead developers on. You know, that's definitely one area where, you know, a security professional should be doing that before it gets to the developers.
And I do think, I find it a little bit interesting because people could pick more than one option here. But number 4, no cooperation between the security and development teams. It's funny to me how much that actually ties into vulnerability prioritization. Like you just said, um, development doesn't want to be bothered by security unless it matters.
Yeah,
And if you don't
developers
prioritize,
think
how do you know?
security
So it hurts the cooperation.
developers' perception is probably that security is just sending them just a massive amount of, you know, like false positives, false leads, and security thinks that developers are not, you know, checking off the list of everything they're being sent.
Makes sense. And here's my process one. Uh, how many people have an agreed upon process? About a third. Um, but a huge amount. We kind of have a process, but it's sort of ad hoc, and we might have different guidelines in the development group and the security group. Um, I'm not too surprised to see it be, um, almost 2/3 here of the people saying, we have something, but it's kind of confusing, and we don't always follow it, and sometimes we agree on it, and sometimes we disagree on it, and maybe I ignore it, because that's where most processes fall down. Compliance and actually making sure they make sense and that everybody agrees that this is the process. So I'm still shocked it's actually 11% of just, we don't agree, but those people definitely need to work on cooperation.
Yeah,
Um,
I mean, this is a pretty well-known challenge in the CVE industry, we'll call it. You know, there was a disclosure just last week by, you know, Google's 0-day team. You know, something had reached the 90-day disclosure period,
yep,
plus a little extension. And, you know, and someone pointed out that internally, when, you know, the Google team member discovered it, he rated it as a high severity issue. When it was issued to CVE, it was classified as medium. And the vendor involved, when they, you know, disclosed it to their customers, classified it as low.
which
So yeah, it doesn't
I,
surprise me that we see, you know, that it's difficult for I mean, so you're a company at the end of that. How do you, you know, how do you? It's hard to have a process around that when you're getting these types of inputs and you have to keep trying to make, you know, subjective
yeah.
judgments.
And the more subjective it is, the less process it is. So, I mean, I get why people have ad hoc practices because some of the data is ad hoc, importance is ad hoc. Some of this information is very hard to kind of prioritize without having some agreed upon standards and something technical to go off of. So it's, you have to pick, okay, we're going to go by CVE severities, not internal, or you have to have some way of prioritizing this. You can solve that kind of problem simply by, hey, if anybody says it's high, we're going to treat it like high, right? So
Yeah,
there's
yeah,
ways, but you have to agree on it, and you can't have everybody following their own rules.
yeah, yeah.
And one way to kind of help that is to pick an AppSec champion. I think that a good chunk of this could be solved, actually, if a little bit more people said, great, let's have this champion, somebody who's an expert, who's driving this. Because once you have a champion, you have a decision maker, and you need a decision maker who builds consensus to be able to create a good process.
Yeah,
Kind of for anything, honestly.
yeah. The yes/no split's a little bit strange, given we talk about the bias a lot. I would have expected, you know, when developers are answering the survey, that they'd be more likely to be from a company with, security leaning developers rather than dedicated AppSec. So I would have expected it to be higher when answered by developers, but well.
Yeah, I don't know. I love the chart on the right though, where it's just very clear, like the impact that having an AppSec champion has.
I think you see, this is like almost independent security. It's like what you've got there is then ownership.
Yeah.
And what it means that, except in the rare cases where it's like, this is a hill I'm willing to die on, people are like, well, we have a process, we have a person, like we have someone, we have a champion, and it's their job to decide. And I'm happy that someone else decides it. Like, I don't want to be
Yeah.
deciding, so many things unnecessarily. So I think it's good when you don't have an assigned, security champion, then people start, arguing over the minutia of stuff.
Yeah, I mean, honestly, every organizational behavior person would say, yeah, of course. So we're kind of wrapping it up down here, but this is sort of our very aspirational piece. Together, let's break the silos and advance towards DevSecOps maturity. But look, it's the summary of everything we just talked about, which is how do you make your DevSecOps more mature? You have to have a program. It has to include prioritization with some standards and process that you agree on. Getting a champion helps you get that. Once you have all of that, the communication really does sort of flow better. And ultimately, you do want to quote shift left, but that's just a buzzword that means make the developers more involved and more responsible and more, what's the word I'm looking for? More responsible.
Yeah.
And of course, you can't just do that, without giving them some real training.
Yeah, I mean, so the traditional definition of shift left is like the earlier you catch things in your software development life cycle, like the better, the cheaper. As a security vendor, I like to extend that a bit. I also think shift left means like giving developers the tools they need to do the job you're asking them to do. So when we say like developers, have responsibility over security, it's like, well, great. But like we do need like visibility into things. We need tools, we need remediation and things like that. So I think it covers both those topics.
I mean, look, we're a tool vendor, and it always makes me cringe when I hear that there's no developers involved in evaluating the tool, and it's just a security team. You're like, no, go get a few developers in there. You want them involved because you're not trying to just check that box. You are trying to actually get it adopted and used.
Exactly.
Cool. So if I did that right, we are 10 minutes to the hour. A little
Welcome
quick.
back, Charlene.
Yes.
Here I come. I'm back. Okay. Hey guys. So many great findings in that survey. I was, man, oh man, oh man. I was actually really surprised by some of those survey findings. And I know, I maybe to you guys it was kind of like just another walk in the park, but I think there were certain things that really stood out for me. One thing that I actually wanted to ask you guys is, do you guys think that it's easier to bring security to DevOps, or is it easier to bring DevOps to security?
Rhys, I'm going to make you go first so that I can
Yeah.
formulate my answer and sound
I
really.
haven't been asked that question before. It's a good one. So bringing security to DevOps. So that's this challenge where we're going to have to teach our dev and our ops people essentially, enough to not make big mistakes and to know when to get help. So I think that's pretty. I think that's pretty achievable. The mistake is when people think that you need to like remove security and just everyone in DevOps, in DevOps combined just becomes your new Avengers team, and that's pretty hard to pull off. The second part is also good. It's like bringing DevOps to security, because traditionally there may have been security people that were more used to kind of more manual, pen testing and manual inspection and stuff like that. Whereas we've all seen the great benefits of automation. So I think that developers knowing they need to be security aware security conscious, while security professionals need to like be able to use kind of DevOps tooling, especially for automation. I think those are both great ways to do it. I'd say it's probably easier though, to answer your question, it's probably easier to teach a security professional like DevOps, like automation, running automated scans and stuff, than it would be to like train your entire development team, DevOps team to be like DevSecOps.
So I
Although
don't,
both are a very good
yeah.
idea.
So I don't disagree, but I completely disagree. And it's because I think that focuses on the technical aspects, and that's all right for that. But from a organizational behavior or from a culture perspective, I think developers are inherently used to making trade-off decisions. They are, if you think about what they do, they usually have deadlines. They have some quick period of time they have to investigate a technology, and then they have to implement it. They make trade-off decisions in architecture and everything else all the time. And security tends to be a little bit more compliancy, and they are risk management experts, and they understand things like prioritization, but they're less willing to make trade-offs. So I think in a mature organization, it's not a horribly bad way to start of saying, okay, let's take our security and embed that more in the development and DevOps teams, because they'll adopt it. And just by the nature of who they are, they automate things, they integrate things, and they are more culturally suited to make trade-off decisions.
All right, then. I have a feeling that that this is a question that will be revisited many, many more times in the future before we actually get an answer, or before we actually don't even need an answer anymore. It could be that, everybody's dev and sec will one day become one role, and then, we won't even have to answer the question.
QA, ops / DevSec's performance. Yeah, just throw
It'll
everybody in
just
one
be
category. Yeah.
It'll just be X ops, and you fill in what X is. So anyway, all right, guys. So we have about maybe 5 or 6 minutes for question and answer period. If you have a question for Rhys or for Jeffrey or for both of them, go ahead and use your GoToWebinar control panel and get it on in. Even if we don't get to all of the questions, please know that they are going to get the copy of the questions that come in. So I'm sure they'll be more than happy to answer your question offline after the event. You guys may have done this question already during your conversation. If so, I apologize. We'll just move ahead. But the first question here, aren't the number of compromises that have escalated the primary reason for application security?
Yeah, we haven't done that one. I do want to get to it, so thanks. So Jeff, that's related to that was asked when we were on the compliance slide being the number one reason why people could justify the purchase of security products.
Yeah, it's interesting, and I'll sort of say it this way. When it comes to justifying actually spending dollars, and actually justifying a cost, it's like what I said, it really doesn't get any easier than we don't have a choice. It's sort of like I just bought a house, so it's in my head. I didn't have to debate about getting house insurance. It's required. You don't have a choice. It wasn't like, oh, what do I spend here? It's I'll get what I have to get. So when you go to an executive to justify it, it makes sense to focus on those pieces. I think that the compromises that have escalated sort of help there, but they're secondary. They're just not as clean cut, unless there's been actually, problems from it, constant complaints, that kind of thing.
So look, I'm going to agree with the question asker in the context of what we talked about on that slide where we said, it'd be interesting to know if you took away those aspects, then what's the reason? And I think, yes, like the number of exploits has been the number one motivation for most people. I hate to say it because I know some people from the new company at least, and they're great, but like no one wanted to be the next Equifax for a while, yeah. Right? It was a really big thing because it was like, look, that's the bad luck. I mean, you could say it's bad other things, but they're not the only company in the history to have ever done, missed something, right? So people realize that it can be very major, and they don't want to be the next one like that.
So
All right, great.
I see a
Go ahead.
great question from I'm not going to pronounce that. I'm not sure if I get it
Judith.
right. But what's the biggest non-technical issue for DevSecOps practice? I have
was just gonna
strong
ask you that one.
strong opinions on that one, but Rhys, like, what do you think it is?
The biggest non-technical issue for DevSecOps practice? Well, I guess it would come down to that cooperation between security teams and development teams. Because ultimately not everything can be automated. Cooperation cannot be put in a pipeline. If there is a distrust between the dev team versus a security professional, if the dev teams thinks that the security professional is just dumping everything on them and not prioritizing, you can't solve that technically, really. That's something that's got to be solved, from a cooperation point of view.
And I'll drag that up one layer because I agree. But I think one thing that helps drive cooperation is making sure you're measuring both teams on the same thing. And because if you measure them separately, if you align the incentives wrong, you end up with bad communication. So what I mean is you can't be doing something crazy like number of vulnerabilities fixed is what you're measuring security on. And then you're then you're measuring developers on getting things out on time. If you don't align the team's goals, you cannot have good communication.
Well, that makes a lot of sense. It's kind of like an apples to oranges comparison, and you just or each side is building a bridge, but they don't have the specs, and so the bridge ends up looking like kind of like this. That just never really comes together.
It's why I think, I'm going to loop it all the way back to the beginning. The number one insight was that they feel like they have to make a compromise. The reason people are making the compromises is because usually security and development do not have the same goal. And if you can align those goals, which requires very senior, executives to do that, if you can align those goals, the compromises stop becoming so much compromises and more become about working together to actually achieve that shared goal.
Excellent. All right. Well, we're 3 minutes to the top of the hour, so unfortunately that's all the time that we have for question and answer period. I know we didn't get to all the questions, but as I said before, please know that Rhys and Jeffrey are getting a copy of all of the questions that came in, and I'm sure somebody from WhiteSource will be more than happy to follow up with you offline and get your question answered. But I do want to thank everybody who did submit questions. There were some really good ones in there. Just a quick reminder to the audience that today's event has been recorded. So if you missed any or all of it, or if you just want to watch it again, you'll have the opportunity to do so. Following the webinar today, we will be sending out an email that contains a link to access the webinar on demand. And the webinar is always going to be living on the DevOps.com website as well. So you can always go find it there. Just go to DevOps.com/webinars, look in the on-demand section, and it should be right there waiting for you. Okay, I did mention at the top of the hour, we'd be doing a drawing for 4 $25 Amazon gift cards. So without further ado, drum roll please. Our first Amazon gift card winner today is Emily R. Congratulations, Emily. Our second winner today is James B. Congratulations, James. Third winner today is Judith L. Congratulations, Judith. And our fourth and final winner today is Dan B. Congratulations, Dan. We'll be following up with all 4 of you via email to get your Amazon gift card over to you. So please check your inbox. If you don't see anything there, please check your spam folder. Rhys and Jeffrey, thank you. As always, what a great conversation. Love to see the survey results in depth. So thanks for sharing them, and thanks as always for your expertise and your time.
Thank you for excellent job hosting. And Rhys, you can go back to the Situation Room. And
Thanks, Jeffrey. Thanks, Charlie.
All right. Also want to thank the audience for joining me today. This is Charlene O'Hanlon, and I'm signing off. Have a great day, everybody, and please stay safe.
Yeah, bye-bye.
Bye.